after the hour, and it's delightful yet again to see so many of you. I must confess, after a long day, when I know I have a Jewish Historical Society event in the evening, I just know that it'll be an occasion of camaraderie on the one hand, and also just learning something important. And I feel that that's the case very, very strongly this evening. And that's because I have the pleasure of actually knowing Joe Cronin very well. I remember when he came to us as a PhD student from Durham to Queen Mary several years ago. He impressed us in his high seriousness. Even then, he had a very interesting subject for his PhD, which now has appeared as a book. And the book is called The Russians Are Coming. And this is about how the tiny German Jewish communities of the post-war were, since the 1980s, really sort of rebuilt and remade, but by Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union or the ex-Soviet Union who came in large numbers and settled in those German cities. And of course, with their distinctive history, really brought totally different qualities, culture, interests to those communities. But it also means that in Germany, there is now a buoyant Jewish life in many major cities. So that came out as a book, and I think that Joe is thinking of the way forward to his next project. I should also say he's a wonderful and caring teacher, and we value that very, very much at Queen Mary. He's a member of our New Generation Historians group that the Jewish Historical Society supports and encourages. And one of the wonderful things is that we have contact with some of the brightest new historians, new voices in Jewish history, as we heard, for example, when we heard Kai speak about the Jews of Wales. So this is not being ageist at all. It's rather welcoming new talent and mixing it well with established talent, I hope, I'm sure. So Joe, I'm delighted that you accepted this invitation, that you've prepared especially for us a talk about a subject that will no doubt be challenging and absolutely new to all of us, I think. And there's no one better than you to introduce us to the subject of how repentance and reconciliation and themes such as these arise from German popular culture. Thank you so much, Joe. So if you want to share your screen now.
Thank you, yes.
I'm sure that we tested it before, so that should not be a problem. Just take your time.
Okay.
That seems to be working, Joe.
Brilliant.
I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. Thank you so much, Miri, for that lovely introduction. And it is a pleasure for me to be speaking here this evening to the Jewish Historical Society of England. It is a strange experience giving a talk essentially from your bedroom, and it's going to take me a while to get used to that. As Miri was saying, my research is really usually about post-war Germany and Jewish immigration to post-war Germany, but I think it's fair to say that the Holocaust always looms in the background of that. So that's how my research kind of links to the topic of this paper I'm going to give today. And just as a quick and probably obvious content warning, I am going to be talking about the Holocaust and Auschwitz, not in a gratuitous way by any means, but I will be touching on those topics. Okay, so I'm going to start with an obvious point, which is that the Holocaust is rapidly slipping from memory into history. Soon it will no longer be possible to see survivors give their testimony in person. You will be able to watch them on screen, of course, and they're also developing even holograms so that future generations will be able to see Holocaust survivors speak, but they'll no longer be around in person. So the human connection with the Holocaust is being lost. And this, I argue, has huge implications for the ways in which the Holocaust is depicted in cultural events and cultural products. Essentially, it gives rise to two things. Firstly, the Holocaust is reified in terms of its commemoration, in terms of memorials and so on. But secondly, and at the same time, representations of the Holocaust in popular culture are becoming increasingly sensational, and one could even argue tasteless. These two contrasting currents have something in common, and that is a focus on Auschwitz. Auschwitz was the largest and most deadly complex of concentration, death, and labor camps that the Nazis developed. Around 1 million Jews were murdered there. But as I'm sure you're aware, Auschwitz does not stand for the totality of the Holocaust by any means. So why has it come to serve this function? Well, the obvious explanation is that Auschwitz is a powerful symbol for the genocide as a whole. And to show you, trying to go to the next slide. There we go. That is a picture of the 70th anniversary commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz in 2015. I found that thing a bit gaudy, if I'm honest, but I think it shows, I mean, obviously that was the liberation of Auschwitz, but the way in which just that frontage of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp has come to be such a powerful visual image of the Holocaust. So Auschwitz is a symbol of the Holocaust, but at the same time, it also simplifies and makes the Holocaust more comprehensible to the general public. This, however, has consequences in that Auschwitz has increasingly become an object of fascination, possibly morbid fascination. And it also leads to the misperception that most, perhaps even all, of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust were murdered at Auschwitz. And I can tell you that my students who I teach at undergraduate level are often surprised when I tell them that nearly half of the Holocaust's total victims were murdered at close range by mobile shooting squads. The Holocaust is, I admit, too complicated to understand in its totality. And perhaps Auschwitz offers a necessary simplification, reducing the Holocaust's breadth to something that human beings can begin to get their heads around, and therefore to care about. But I'll say it again, this simplification inevitably has consequences. In the early 1980s, the historian Saul Friedlander, you may have heard of him, he's written a wonderful 2-volume work on the Holocaust, and he is, he's still alive, a survivor himself. But in the early 1980s, Saul Friedlander wrote about what he called the fetishization of the Nazi aesthetic. And in this context, fetish means an unhealthy obsession with something. So Friedlander was writing in response to the so-called Hitler wave of the 1970s, which saw a stream of books and films which seemed a little too fascinated with the aesthetic aspects of Nazism. So the jackboots and leather uniforms and so on. And of course with Hitler as well. A good example from the Hitler wave is, oh, gotta learn how to change the slides, is Hans-Jürgen Sieberberg's 1977 film Hitler, ein Film aus Deutschland. You can probably translate the title yourself. But what we're seeing now, this was in the late 70s, what we're seeing now in the second decade of the 21st century is, I argue, the fetishization of the Holocaust aesthetic. This is probably the most well-known and one of the more egregious examples. The 2006 novel and subsequently the film, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which was wildly popular, but also attracted a significant amount of criticism for its historical inaccuracies, both of fact and of tone. And a couple of years ago, I was listening to the testimony of the Holocaust survivor, Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, and she was scathing. She was really scathing about The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, describing it as grossly inaccurate and unhelpful as an educational tool. Unfortunately, however, that is exactly what it has become in many schools. But The Boy in the Striped Pajamas appears to have sparked a trend. And I don't know if you'll be able to make sense of this, but this is a screenshot of a tweet I did earlier in the year. It's a photo I took myself of what I call Auschwitz section, and this was in a supermarket. This is the recent exponential growth in what I call Auschwitz novels. There are actually many, many more than this now. It's an ever-growing genre. The question is, why is it so popular? Why are these books so popular? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Auschwitz provides a ready-made setting. It provides a stage, if you will, with its own recognizable aesthetic, complete with stage set and props, you know, barbed wire, striped pajamas, watchtowers, guards, dogs, barracks, a train line, you know, the ramp, need I go on? And it also provides emotional tropes to the fiction writer: separation, grief, trauma. And this is frankly rich terrain for a lot of fiction writers. Many of these books claim to have been inspired by true events, but there's a lot of fictionalization going on here too. So yes, the fiction writers have got a lot of tropes and a lot of themes that they can draw on for all these books. Now, with the passing of the Holocaust into history, this kind of exploitation of the Holocaust, and I do believe it's exploitation in many cases, is becoming more acceptable as the Holocaust's gatekeepers, and by gatekeepers I generally mean the survivors, are disappearing. A good example is Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and public figure in America, who always maintained that the Holocaust was unrepresentable in fiction. The second generation, the children of the survivors, simply don't have that same kind of moral authority. But the Holocaust has now percolated all aspects of popular culture, not just books. And in this talk, I'm focusing on recent popular culture because this is how a lot of young people are receiving their information about the Holocaust. The moment I realized this is a little embarrassing to admit to. I was watching a reality television show in which celebrities, very minor celebrities, are made to go on dates with members of the general public. This is sort of bottom of the barrel, lowbrow culture, I will admit it. Now, to get to the point, the celebrity in question was a young man. He wasn't even known to me. I think he's probably famous as a YouTube blogger or something, and I imagine he's popular with young people. And on his date, he's struggling to get a conversation going with the young woman he's been paired with, until one of them, I forget who it was, raises the subject of Auschwitz. And immediately they're talking. They're talking about the Auschwitz novels they've read. One says, I visited Auschwitz twice. The other says, oh, that's great. I'd really love to go, that sort of thing. And it's all in an entirely jovial and light-hearted way, almost as if these two had discovered a shared passion for a genre of music. So once I'd picked my jaw up off the floor, I started to think about the implications of this new Auschwitz consciousness, this new way of thinking about and relating to the Holocaust, which I, as a Holocaust educator, won't be able to stop, however many misgivings I may have about it. But once I calmed down, I thought, okay, well, there is a debate here. And the debate is this. Is it better that people know about the Holocaust in some form, through reading these books, for example? Or would it be better that they didn't know about it at all than know about it in this rather trivialized form? So that's something I'm going to leave you to think about, because I'm not sure what the answer is. Nonetheless, I think it's a very serious and important debate that's only going to become more pronounced over the coming years, because we're now moving into new territory, and we can no longer insist that people only get their information about the Holocaust from respected sources like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, because they simply won't. Many people are and are going to continue to get the majority of their information about the Holocaust from books like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas or The Tattooist of Auschwitz, not to mention representations on film and television. And on that note, I want to move on to what this paper is really about, because it's based on an essay which I submitted and which was shortlisted for the Alpine Fellowship Prize this year. Now, the theme of the prize was forgiveness and retribution. And I probably would never have written anything for it had it not coincided with the launch of a new television series on Amazon Prime, which for a brief period of time seemed to bombard me everywhere I went. I saw adverts on the side of buses and in tube stations, wrapped around free newspapers. I watched a trailer for it on the concourse at King's Cross Station, which I thought rather tempted the viewer with the promise of gratuitous violence. And that television show was called Hunters. Let me show you, if I can, the promotional poster. Now, I should mention that the essay I wrote already feels like a snapshot in time. I wrote it between mid-February and mid-March, just as the coronavirus was sweeping across the world, but before we'd really started to feel its effects, at least in this country. So it's been strange coming back to that essay for this talk in what now feels like a completely different world. I don't think anyone cares about the TV show Hunters anymore, but at the time it felt really important. So, as you can see, the press response to Hunters was decidedly mixed, one might say. I'll give you a few seconds to digest those headlines, which I sourced from various UK and American newspapers. I think the top one is actually from Haaretz, The Guardian, maybe the New York Times. Anyway, that's a sort of representative snapshot of some reviews of the show. Most people didn't think it was all that great. But then within a few days, this happened. Okay, so this is also a tweet from the Auschwitz Memorial that got very widely retweeted, as you can see at the bottom. This, let me explain what this image and the text is saying. It became apparent that there was a scene in Hunters, this TV show, in which there was a flashback to Auschwitz. And in this flashback, inmates were made to play a game of human chess. The problem was that this never happened in reality. It was a fiction. It was made up for the purposes of the show. And people were understandably outraged about this. This fictional representation sort of masquerading as if it were reality. The resulting media furore almost stopped me working on the essay altogether, because I actually initially didn't want to write about the chess scene. I could well understand why that scene had prompted outrage, but it wasn't what really fascinated me about the series. But if this scene had completely disqualified the series from analysis, then what was the point, really, in engaging with its other, less scandalous aspects? But after a brief hesitation, I decided to press on. Okay, so what is Hunters about? It's set in New York in the late 1970s. And the scenario is this. National socialists who escaped to America after the collapse of Hitler's Third Reich in 1945, and who managed to evade justice, have now infiltrated the upper echelons of the United States government. They are now plotting to seize power and create a Fourth Reich out of one of the world's largest and most established democracies. Now, there's already an element of implausibility here, because while Hitler admired the way in which the original white settlers to America had destroyed most of the Native American population and subjugated Black African slaves, Hitler also believed that by the 20th century, America had thoroughly debased itself through its open-door immigration policy and the subsequent mixing of what he considered different racial groups. One of these groups was, of course, the Jews, and Hitler believed that they, in particular, had come to dominate and indeed control American politics, economics, and society to the point that it could well be argued that the Nazis would not have wanted to take control of the United States, even if they had had the opportunity. It felt outside of their colonial aspirations, which lay predominantly, as we know, in Eastern Europe. But I will leave that point for now. Hunters, the TV show, is not so much an exercise in counterfactual invention like Philip Roth's 2004 novel, The Plot Against America. What it is, in essence, is a revenge fantasy. And it's this revenge aspect that really piques my interest. Now, the plot hinges around a young Jewish man. You can see him on the right. He's called Jonah Heidelbaum. And at the beginning of the series, his grandmother gets killed by a Nazi. Obviously, this is not during the Holocaust. This is in 1970s Manhattan. The young man then seeks revenge on whoever was responsible. And in doing so, discovers a group known as the Hunters. These are vigilantes who have taken it upon themselves to hunt down and eliminate the Nazis who are plotting to take over the country. The young man's grandmother, it turns out, was a major player in the Hunters, hence why the Nazis had her killed. But who are these Hunters? Well, some of them are Jewish and have personal, familial links to the Holocaust. Their leader is called Meyer Offerman. He's played here, as you can see, by Al Pacino. Offerman is a Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor and philanthropist. Other Hunters, however, are not Jewish and have no personal link to the Holocaust. So their motives are somewhat less clear. People tend not to commit risky and illegal acts like joining a vigilante group unless there's some personal motivation. Some of the Hunters are people of color. And I think that raises interesting questions in terms of motives, but it's not something that I have time to go into here. Now, the show's producers claim to have been inspired by Nazi hunters throughout history, notably Nakam. You can see, this is actually not Nakam, this is a group of partisans in Vilna in the early 1940s, but you can see the young man standing in the middle. His name is Abba Kovner. So after the war, Kovner, who was a Holocaust survivor, set up a group of Nakam, which is a Hebrew term, it literally means revenge. They were a group of around 50 Holocaust survivors, led by Kovner. I'll talk more about them in a minute. But of course, the other and probably most famous Nazi hunter, indeed, he had the moniker of the Nazi hunter, was Simon Wiesenthal. And his character actually makes a cameo appearance in the TV show Hunters. So Nakam were certainly violent in their intent. They initially planned to kill 6 million Germans by poisoning the water supply before they downscaled their plans and targeted former members of the SS. Wiesenthal, on the other hand, was not violent. He sought to bring former Nazi perpetrators to legal justice as opposed to killing them. And I think that's an important distinction. So why does the revenge in the TV show Hunters have to be violent? I suppose the obvious answer is that this is television and violence is more appealing to a mass audience than a drawn-out legal battle. But then this raises a further and perhaps more philosophical question, which is, why is violence so appealing? To answer this question, I first have to address an apparent contradiction in contemporary Western societies. On the one hand, we, and I say we as a member of one of these societies, we espouse tolerance, we espouse recognition of difference, and an increasing awareness of mental health issues. And on the other hand, we lap up shows in which people are violently murdered. In the case of hunters, these are meant to be righteous, justified acts that we're supposed to celebrate. Now, some of the characters in Hunters do raise moral scruples about the justifiability of such acts, but I think this is a fig leaf for a debate that does not actually exist. There is a right answer as far as the show's producers are concerned, and that is that it is morally justifiable to kill Nazis by vigilante means. Why is this the case? Well, first of all, the Holocaust revenge fantasy, strange as it may sound, is now an established genre of its own. It was pioneered by the 2009 Quentin Tarantino film Inglourious Basterds, and that is how it's actually spelt, in which similarly a vigilante group of Jewish and non-Jewish US service personnel go about killing Nazis towards the end of World War II. What's notable about Inglourious Basterds is the lack of seriosity with which the subject matter is treated. It's almost like a comic book film. And this is something that Hunters very much picks up on as well. You could definitely say that the latter is inspired by the former. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about the passage of time and the fading of the Holocaust from living memory, the disappearance of its gatekeepers. So people no longer feel quite so constrained in how they depict the events of the Holocaust in fiction. But to return to the question I posed, which is, why is it okay for vigilante groups to kill Nazis in these films? Well, one explanation has been put forward by the Holocaust historian Bill Niven, who argues that the rise in Holocaust revenge fantasies is a response to what he calls the, quote, total failure of the post-war judicial and political system to address adequately the crimes of Nazism. These films therefore, quote, respond to a contemporary sense that the process of coming to terms with Nazism may well have failed, end quote. And in this regard, one could also cite Mary Fulbrook's recent excellent book, Reckonings, which I think really blows the lid off the notion that West Germany dealt well or even adequately with its Nazi past in terms of bringing perpetrators to justice, but also more broadly in terms of denazifying society and what the Germans call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past. Now, I certainly accept these arguments, but I also think that the violent revenge meted out in Hunters and Inglourious Basterds has an even deeper explanation, one that goes to the heart of cultural discourse in Western societies today. In short, people are finding it increasingly difficult to identify evil within themselves. Evil has to be externalized it has to be projected onto another group. One can, of course, argue that this is nothing new. It is a human trait that one finds in all societies. It is indeed this trait that has led to the persecution of minority groups throughout history. The majority group projects all its problems, social, economic, political, you name it, onto a minority group or groups who are then made to shoulder the blame and are then, quote unquote, punished accordingly. But in these scenarios, it is, of course, the majority group doing the perpetrating. And that means that people are more likely to be perpetrators than victims. In spite of that, contemporary popular culture has encouraged us, its consumers, to identify solely with the victim and not with the perpetrator. Think about the Auschwitz novels I spoke about earlier. Or to take another example, again, a fairly egregious example, the curiously named Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, California, which provides visitors with a passport card upon entry to its Holocaust exhibition. The card contains, as you can see there, the photo and name of a child, quote, whose life was affected by the events of the Holocaust, end quote. And as you go around the exhibition, the card is updated with new information until at the end, the child's fate is finally revealed. Now, my first problem with this card method is that it fetishizes suffering, because people are essentially just going to want to know whether or not the child died. And this is a true, you know, these are real children who existed. But the bigger issue is that it encourages the visitor to take the perspective of and thus relate to a victim, as opposed to a perpetrator or, most likely of all, a bystander. Yet it is much more likely that the average white American would be a perpetrator or a bystander than a victim. The result of all of this identifying with the victim is that we become incapable of seeing the potential for perpetration within ourselves. And this, I believe, is a dangerous trend. It is no coincidence that all of the Nazis in Hunters and in Inglourious Bastards and in the Boy in the Striped Pajamas are Nazis in the mold of Himmler, Goebbels, or Goering. They are cold, ruthless monsters. They are not the ordinary men, as Christopher Browning put it in his famous study. They're not the ordinary men. They're not the nondescript desk killers. They're not the cajoled policemen or the loving fathers, those who enabled the Holocaust to actually happen. Men, and indeed women, who wanted to advance their careers, men who had become desensitized to violence and brutality through their experiences of the First World War or through traumatic upbringings. Not that a traumatic upbringing excuses perpetration, by the way, since most people who suffer traumatic upbringings don't go on to perpetrate acts of violence, but it is nonetheless noteworthy that many senior Nazis were beaten as children, Hitler included. And in present-day Western societies, this kind of upbringing would be viewed sympathetically, and one would be encouraged to speak with a qualified psychiatric professional. What we end up with then in Hunters, but in popular culture more generally, is a strict dichotomy between us, the victims, and them, the perpetrators. And we therefore lose the ability to see ourselves in the perpetrators. The perpetrators become the other. We can't explain or engage with their behavior, and so they must be irredeemably evil and deserving of the most absolute punishment. In Hunters, and in Inglourious Bastards, and in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, the Nazis are caricatures of evil, because we, the viewers, have no purchase on them. We have no framework for explaining them otherwise, because we are only able to relate to the victims. And in this fixation on victimhood, we overlook the common traits, behaviors, and personality types that create perpetrators. These exist in our societies. They are not something actually to bemoan, that they will always be with us. But we have to learn to identify and understand and indeed treat these better. Otherwise, a perpetrator by definition will always be a monster and not a regular human being whose life experiences have prompted him or her to choose. And I do not deny that we all have the agency to choose to perpetrate acts of evil. The moral complexity of a death camp commandant who kisses his children every night after a day killing Jews would not and could not be introduced into a show like Hunters, because it complicates its dichotomous depiction of perpetrators and victims. Kissing one's children is a good act, and good acts must be performed by good people, while bad acts like murdering Jews must be performed by bad people. The corollary of this way of thinking is that evil can be identified, targeted, and then totally exorcised from society like a tumor. And ironically, this is how the Nazis understood evil too. It resided within the so-called Jewish race, which they believed was a threat not only to the so-called Aryan race, but to the whole of humanity. Not that the Nazis really believed in a common humanity, but the Jews certainly stood outside of it. And like a bacillus or a parasite, they had to be removed completely. Now, to portray the mostly Jewish hunters in the show Hunters as possessing this dichotomous view about good and evil leads down a very dark path indeed. And it surprises me that the show's producers did not pick up on the implications. Firstly, because it creates a kind of moral equivalence between Jews and their former tormentors, the Nazis. Jews are thereby just as bad as the Nazis if given half a chance. And this is a trope. This is a trope that one sees played out sometimes in discussions about the state of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. But it also taps into a deeper historical trope about the vengeful Jews, you know, the vengeful Jews with their vengeful Old Testament God who will not forgive. Well, I'm coming to the end of the paper now, you might be pleased to hear, but I still don't think I fully explained why the revenge fantasies in shows like Hunters have to be so violent, given that violence is increasingly stigmatized in almost all human societies. Well, maybe not amongst supporters of Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin, but the show is named at them. It has actually a decidedly liberal agenda. So I'm going to leave you with two possible explanations to think about. The first is that humans have some inbuilt need for violence. We deny it, we repress it, but we will always find some way of expressing it. And secondly, perhaps the violence in Hunters is actually self-directed. subconsciously, we, and by we, I mean the predominantly non-Jewish viewers, know that we are in fact the bystanders and the perpetrators. We won't admit it. We like to identify with the victims because it makes us feel better. But deep down, we know otherwise. We know we would have shunned the Jews when push came to shove, and people would have bought their property and their businesses when they were auctioned off. The people who would have stamped the deportation documents and operated the railway signals and countless other things that were needed to make the Holocaust happen, not least of which is simply turning a blind eye. And for that reason, we must be punished. Okay, well, that's a rather sour note to end on, so I'll just quickly say something else. When I was finishing writing this essay, it occurred to me that Hunters is set around the same time, the late 1970s, around the time that French filmmaker Claude Lanzmann started making his epic 8-hour documentary film, Shoah. Shoah is a chronicle of the Holocaust, told from the perspective of victims, bystanders, and perpetrators. And in one scene, a famous scene, Lanzmann secretly films an interview with a former SS officer called Franz Suchomel. And you can see here, it's secretly filmed in the early days of secret filming, hence the quality. Secretly filmed at his suburban home, where he was living a very comfortable life in West Germany. Now, at one point in the interview, after describing the horrific conditions at the Treblinka death camp where he worked, Suchomel beseeches Lanzmann. He beseeches him with the words, "But please, don't use my name." And Lanzmann responds, "No, I won't. I have promised." Now, of course, he does use his name. And to my mind, this is a quiet but nonetheless very powerful act of revenge. Perhaps one of the most powerful acts of revenge ever committed to film. Because in the year 2020, we'd need a band of hunters to storm Suchomel's home and blow his head off or something. We've become so desensitized. But Claude Lanzmann possessed tact and a sharper sense of justice. He maneuvered the situation with devastating dignity. And in doing so, he did more damage to Suchomel than the hunters ever could. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, I am happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Joe. I hope I'm expressing the view of many of us that I'm grateful to you for having gone into this material, watched these sort of things, studied them. I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't even know about them. And quite frankly, it must be a very odd experience. So you've done a service, because we should know about what our students are watching, younger members of our families are watching, our neighbors are watching, what is out there. And I think what you managed to do is to show, well, I think many of us agree that the tastelessness, the lack of reflection, but this is part of the world that we live in. There will be wonderful books like the one that we mentioned earlier, East-West Street, deeply researched, sophisticated. There will be all sorts of levels of remembering and making sense, or trying to make sense of the Holocaust. But you've taken us to a place that actually probably far more people consume. And for that, I'm very grateful to you. There are already a few comments in the chat box. I invite people to write in the chat box, or to try and grab my attention. I'm just going to move to a mode where I see all of you or most of you, and I can see if you're raising your hand. And I encourage you to raise your hand. Yes, I see Jonathan Marrow, who is an educator of young people. I don't know if you're aware of all of this world out there, Jonathan. And then we're going to move on to AJ Friedlander. We'll work down the list. Yes, Jonathan Marrow.
Thank you for your talk. And it's fascinating because I teach even 13-year-olds, and their first homework assignment I give my students every semester in my course on the Holocaust is, what do you know about the Holocaust? What do you know about Judaism? And my students say nothing. I mean, and I teach in Tennessee, so that's a good clarification. What have you read about the Holocaust? They know nothing about Judaism. They don't know it's monotheistic religion. They don't know what a rabbi is. And yet all of my students have read 2-3 kids novels already about the Holocaust. Oh, I know about Auschwitz. Oh, I know the boy. And it's amazing how much they know about this one thing. And they come in with this zeal for all these novels. And anyway, so it's fascinating. What I'm curious about, I think about your talk, is how much you focused on a lot of American and British shows and novels. And I've seen those collections as well. But I'm curious about how it works in Germany today. I'm thinking of a film I watched recently, Look Who's Back, if you know it.
Yes.
This very funny German film, which makes fun of how Germans are all, are forgetting or how they treat Hitler as a joke now. But is there the same obsession with revenge in German popular culture?
Thank you for that.
Great question.
Yeah, wow. Let me see. I would say not. I would say the revenge angle is probably easier to take for countries that were sort of part of the Allied or the winning side in World War II. And I think in Germany, this discussion of revenge is much more taboo. I think the novel and the film that you mentioned, is Wieder da, or Look Who's Back, as you rightly say, treated the whole topic of Hitler, Nazism, and indeed to some degree the Holocaust with a degree of lightheartedness. And I think that is a parallel that one can see between German popular culture and Anglo-American popular culture about the Holocaust, is that it's gradually becoming less somber, and you can make jokes about Hitler and you can make jokes about the Third Reich. But to the best of my knowledge, and just sort of skimming over what I know of German film and books, it's actually much more about forgiveness, interestingly. And I didn't talk very much about forgiveness in the talk. I fully accept that. But if you were to take the famous novel, the Reader, in German, Der Vorleser, it's really more of a story about forgiveness and how the woman protagonist who was the perpetrator is actually, if not forgiven, but her crimes are sort of explained and excused on the basis that she's illiterate. So I think the tone is slightly different, actually, between Anglo-American and German popular culture in this regard. And I think the revenge aspect is something I see coming through a lot more in British, but particularly in American films and TV. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. That's a really interesting difference. Now, AJ Friedlander, I'm afraid I don't know your first name, so but you have an interesting question here. The question is, how do you think that the film Jojo Rabbit fits into your thesis that is about the identity of the perpetrator, bystander, and victim, all these different personas?
Yeah, I was reading some of these and I thought, oh no, the one about Jojo Rabbit. I'm not hugely familiar with Jojo Rabbit. It's one of the ones I haven't seen. Could AJ Friedlander maybe elaborate a little bit, and then and then maybe I could answer more fully, or
you'll have to unmute if you're muted.
I'm not muted now. Hello, I'm Ariel.
Oh, hi, Ariel.
Hi. It won't let me change my name.
Oh, okay.
I tried. In the film, a little boy who has no friends creates his imaginary. we follow him, and we see how he's been brought up in a small village in Germany to believe all that the Nazis have taught, and he wants to be in the Hitler Youth. And Hitler is presented at the beginning as very much a jokey kind of buddy that he has when he doesn't really have any other friends. But as we go through the story, and in the end, we find out that his mother's executed for being part of the resistance. She's been hiding a Jewish girl, and he meets the Jewish girl secretly, and they talk to each other and get to know each other. And she thinks of all the Germans and as being Nazi monsters, and he thinks of Jews as all being monsters. And through the encounter between the two of them, when they come out at the end of the war and go out together into the world, it's not an idea that I had really seen portrayed before in any. I don't usually watch anymore really these kinds of films, but there was something in that was just, to me, felt very different. And in terms of what you were saying about the other films, this is something that's also come out in popular culture, and it's just in the last year or so. And you do see at the end, as he grows more aware of how humans are and how people are through the relationship with the Jewish girl, the caricature of Hitler, the Hitler gets angrier and meaner and nastier until in the end he gets rid of him, basically kind of kills him off. And so I was just wondering, continuing what you were saying today, first of all, what you thought about that, but also, is there anything else that is out there that younger people are seeing and watching that isn't necessarily only this kind of caricature?
Well, it sounds like you have to go into your you have to read this, because
revenge.
You may also, Joe, want, if you pursue this area, which I think is very interesting and important, you may well want to differentiate between what people target at children induced by various pieties about childhood, and what they produce for, as it were, knowing grown-ups.
I mean that. Absolutely, and there are people out there who do this as their main research area, so they'll have a much more comprehensive knowledge than me. And for me, I'm sort of interested. I take a very keen interest in what's out there, what's being consumed, particularly by younger people. So absolutely, I will go and watch Jojo Rabbit, because I can't comment on it in any sort of in any kind of intelligent way, but it does sound very interesting and perhaps a little more complex than some of the examples I've given, and complexity tends to be a good thing.
Just to form a question from that, is there anything else that you have come across in your research that is not exactly, I mean, is there any alternative or any different perspective apart from this in terms of what's out there now?
There is. I mean, in terms of what's out there now, I'm not so sure. But the one I always recommend to students and to younger people is still Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the graphic novel. I know that's like 30 years old now, but I mean, even I learned a lot reading that, and it's very accessible.
Ian Cobden is raising.
It's really very accurate, well told. It raises all sorts of complex moral questions. I absolutely love it. I wish, and there may well be something of that kind of quality more recently, but I guess I'm not aware of it at the present time. In terms of film, I'm certainly not sure. Most of the films that get made are either pitched at too high a level for younger people or tend to be slightly trivializing or sensationalist, I find.
Before I bring in Colin and Alice, I just want to say that Dolph says that, I don't know if you've read this, Joe. I remember Cornelius Swyk, the former director of the Anne Frank Foundation, Amsterdam, saying in a speech at the opening of the Anne Frank exhibition in Leeds in 1986 that everyone has the propensity for evil as well as good. I'm paraphrasing his words.
I mean, that is... it's also been said by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in different words. And I remember Primo Levi, the famous Holocaust survivor and writer, actually profoundly disagreed with it, because he said that, you know, it depends on the circumstance. In certain circumstances, some people are evil and some people are good, and if everyone has the propensity for it, it doesn't always manifest itself. So that, I mean, is a hugely complicated issue, and I think I'd probably have to be a trained philosopher to think about that more deeply. But yeah, it's certainly something worth thinking about.
Joe, since you mentioned Primo Levi, I should just say that over the last 2 Sundays and the third Sunday, that is coming Sunday, the BBC Radio 4, I think it was, maybe Radio, well, you'll find it very easily, had a wonderful, wonderful program about his periodic table, which is a collection of short stories, but both dramatized and with background about him. I cannot recommend it too strongly. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's just there on iPlayer. You can easily find the periodic table. But let's move on to Colin Elmer, who had, I believe, a comment.
Yeah. Just as you were talking, Mary, I was reminded of a film of Primo Levi's, The Truce, with John Turturro, which I think is a marvelous, which describes his journey back from the camps to Turin. I mean, just amazing film. Like you, I have questions about fictionalizing the Holocaust, but I guess, you know, it's through fiction that one can explore some of the philosophical questions behind any sort of issue, and in a way Jojo Rabbit does that in a way. But I was reminded of a very popular TV program in the late 70s, early 80s, American series called Holocaust, which was a soap opera. I know Elie Wiesel, amongst others, was very critical of it. He said it trivializes the Holocaust and so on and so on. And yet when it was shown in Germany, it provoked an enormous discussion amongst the post-war generation about the Shoah. They started questioning their parents and grandparents. What did you do during the war? So I guess we can't always, I suppose my comment is we can't always know what effect fictionalizing something will have. And maybe sometimes it's only time which will tell. But that's not an endorsement of some of the sort of more crass fictionalization of the Shoah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Yes, and I was actually thinking about that miniseries Holocaust when I raised the question of whether it's better that people know about the Holocaust in some form through these slightly trivialized soap opera type of representations, or is it better that they don't know about it at all? And I think the roots of that debate probably go back to the miniseries Holocaust and Elie Wiesel, and I think Sol Friedlander as well, who was also critical, said, well, it might be better that people didn't watch it at all. But as you rightly say, in Germany it had this huge momentous effect, and people were calling up the broadcaster, and they had to have a sort of a phone-in show about it, and it prompted discussions in families about perpetration and so forth. So it did have a very powerful effect and an enduring effect as well. So that's why it's such a complicated debate about these representations. So you raise an excellent point. Thank you very much.
I should say, though, that I remember even, was it the 90s, going to see Schindler's List in Cambridge in my local cinema. And, you know, I'd grown up my whole life with the Holocaust from a child. I grew up in Israel. I mean, you know, obviously, although we're not a family of survivors, but it's every day of my life. But I was sitting in the cinema and I was seeing all these people in floods of tears. And it was the first time that this, you know, perfectly ordinary British people, you know, maybe a lot of them were students possibly, had actually sort of thought about it in a sustained manner for 2-3 hours or whatever it was. And so I also felt that maybe this is the beginning of something. But that was not trivializing. That was, I suppose, trying to show the complexity of human, because he was, after all, a crook. And yet he did all this stuff. So maybe it was aiming at that sort of, and the production values were very high, unlike some of the stuff that you showed, us. But I want to say, Joe, that I was, a few years ago, I was visited to speak at a Center for the History of the Holocaust in the University of Vermont. They just wanted me to speak about medieval anti-Judaism, but they are actually a center for Holocaust studies. And I met at lunch their various MA and PhD students. So just out of politeness, a charming group, mostly young women. And I sort of said, so what brought you to the subject? Because I sort of thought they probably weren't Jewish. And I remember two of the young women who were then starting PhDs, they said that their interest in the Holocaust had started with the boy in the striped pajamas. Now, clearly it didn't remain there. There was something there that then they could nurture and read more and go on, and they were serious individuals or whatever. But, and they're devoting their lives now to it. But, and I'm sure that's a minority response, a minority experience, but nonetheless, it also arises from those sort of encounters. Yeah.
It's why it's so complicated, yeah.
I think Alice had something to say here about this philosophical question of how can we be made to think through the perpetration in a way that isn't fascination, but is also taking the measure of our own fallibility and our own ability to do evil. I hope I've done justice to your question, Alice.
Yeah, I understand. It is very, very difficult because people don't want to identify with those two sort of those two figures of the perpetrator and the bystander, because they're not doing the right thing. However, we can see throughout numerous historical examples that and particularly being a bystander is the default in terms of what people do. And so obviously here I'm talking about the sort of majority society who are not likely to be victimized by basis of their identity. I think perhaps one of the things, I have to be careful how I say this, is to sort of take the moral component out of it a little bit, because people hear the word perpetrator, they hear the word bystander, and they associate it with negative connotations. But if you strip that away just for a while and say, well, look, this is the kind of behavior, and this is why people behave like that, either because they want to protect their families, or that they don't want to be killed, or whatever, then you can start to unpack how ordinary people who aren't sort of inherently evil, can end up turning a blind eye, or even in some way complicit in these acts of perpetration. Obviously, I do put a sort of moral value on those actions, but I think to begin with, you need to sort of take that out so that people can just objectively see the road, the pattern that leads to those kinds of behaviors.
Well, thank you, Joe. And I think that is where two things I think we have to finish, and I just want to say these two things, and they're all prompted by your excellent presentation. One is to say that is where actually sometimes, say, a Jewish scholar looking comparatively at another type of genocide, which is different, which is in a different context, helps you observe the process of becoming a perpetrator, maybe in a context that you're not so invested in emotionally, or think that you know the answers to, one. And secondly, this is not work for the survivors. This is maybe not even work for the children of the survivors. Not everybody has the ability to do it within themselves. But we have to all do different tasks in the engagement and the memory and the attempt to understand, not justify, but understand what that whole impossible chapter of human history is. And the interesting thing is, I think we'll all agree, this is a job, not for Jewish historians alone. This is the job for everyone, anywhere, who takes an interest and want to make a contribution. So in that spirit, I want to thank you all very, very much for your attentive listening, for your intelligent contributions, but above all, to you, Joe, for taking us by the hand through this really difficult terrain. Thank you so much. And Caroline, thank you as ever for making this whole event possible. Caroline Morris. Good night, everyone. Keep safe. We'll meet again on the 23rd, I hope, and we will send you information about it. And do tell your friends. And remember that being a member of the Jewish Historical Society allows you to take part in these really, I think, very edifying occasions. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I don't know how to do the clapping hands. Where does one do it? If I'd found it, I would have joined.